All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining in or who may be listening in later. We are very excited today to have Dr. Torsten George here with us. He is, let's say, a global traveler. He is well renowned for his work in cybersecurity and also the VP of product marketing at ConnectWise. Super excited to have him here today. He's got 30 plus years in IT and cybersecurity and also the author of Zero Trust Privilege for Dummies. And today we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. Well, I should say Dr. Torsten will be talking about a couple of different things. We're going to be talking about emerging cybersecurity threats, industry standards and regulation compliance landscape and why that's so important. Dr. Torsten is going to talk about the effectiveness of cybersecurity frameworks, and then also what does it look like resource-wise for allocation and budgeting for cybersecurity. And then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. So thank you again, Dr. Torsten, for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks. And by the way, you call me Torsten. That's fine.
Torsten works.
Um,
Sounds good.
yeah. So, I mean, before we start, I wanted to kind of set a common language. So when we talk today, you will hear terms like attacks, events, incident, and breaches. So just to define that upfront, an attack is really an attempt to bypass an organization's security efforts, but there are millions of events per second that occur. They're not necessarily successful. An event, as a difference to the attack, is where it has bypassed one or more levels of security, but it really did not require human intervention to resolve. What's an example? For instance, you can have identity access management solutions in place that detect that there's an unauthorized request, and it basically blocks that request. It doesn't allow the attacker to progress, and that's called an event. And then we have incidents. Incident bypassed one or more levels of security, required human interventions to correct it, meaning there's a security analyst that will take actions, but the hacker was not able to exploit, retrieve, exfiltrate any information. So that's an incident. And then worst case scenario, that's where it's nicely done in red, is a breach. So you bypass the security controls and you might modify, delete, extract, or read data. That's what we call as a breach. And so just setting a common language here so that when we talk later, everybody understands what we're talking about. So Chuck asked me kind of, hey, we started talking, let's talk about emerging cybersecurity threats. I get up every morning at 4:30. I'm an early bird, and one of the first things that I do is I check out the news. And unfortunately, for instance, SecurityWeek is a very good source. You hear about data breaches and incidents almost every single day.
Yeah.
And so it's quite stunning, and especially if you're in a small business, can be fearful, overwhelming. What should I do? What I don't want to be part of any of those headlines. And one of the first thing that always comes to mind, who might come after me? Who might try to attack me? And so we all obviously watched some of the movies where you have this hooded guy sitting in a dark room, or you have legions of people sit in front of kind of computer monitors and just hacking away the so-called state-sponsored attackers. Um, Reality is quite different. If you open the arrest warrants of some of these hackers, you will be surprised. It might be your best friend. It might be the granny next door, your own teen, or the Boy Scout that you bought your popcorn from. So these are normal, common people. It's not necessarily that stereotype that's being presented in the movies. And quite frankly, when you look at who are the real adversaries, uh, 65% of attacks are driven by external adversaries. predominantly these are cyber criminals. These are not state-sponsored attackers. It's about state-sponsored attackers make up about 2 to 4% of all of the attacks. Primarily criminals that are trying to get money out of their actions. 35% of attacks are originating from internal threats. These can be by humans that make mistakes or by malicious insiders. And you can see there's an uptick. There has been a 15% increase over last year. And you might now be wondering, why is that? We always see these upticks in times of economic hardship. We have seen high inflation rates. People had to look out what money is left in their wallet. And so they are more open. They can get approached by an attacker and say, just give me your credential. I pay you $2,000. That's all you have to do. You're not actively doing something. Just give me your credentials. And that's very tempting. $2,000, correct? And so that's where we see this uptick, and you can see when it involves partner, that's close to 0%. So that's the real cyber adversaries, correct? But then we also read a lot of these headlines about, oh, zero-day attacks and distributed denial of service attacks. DDoS attacks, there are basically connected devices or botnets that are being used to overwhelm a victim's website or their network with traffic and take that down. But the reality is, and here again, the nomenclature comes into play, it's very rare for DDoS to feature in a confirmed data breach. It's an incident. It's not a data breach. There's no exfiltration of data associated with it. And then over the last few months, we have heard a lot about zero-day attacks, and it appears that, man, this must be a very common tactic that is being used. But the reality is only 0.4% of the total number of vulnerabilities that have been exploited over the last decade have been zero-day vulnerabilities. In reality, unfortunately, we still face a problem where we are overwhelmed with the number of vulnerabilities that we might detect within an organization, and we don't know where to start. And a good example is the Pudo vulnerability, which came out in 2016. And most companies initially completely ignored it. It had a CVS score of 7.8. Nobody moves their hand before it is 8.5 and above. And so nobody really jumped onto the bandwagon to patch it. But it was actively exploited and it became a big issue. But even today, almost 10 years later, the same vulnerability exists in many of the organizations. And that's what attackers take advantage of. It's not necessarily zero-day attacks. So now our audience might scratch their head and say, okay, this guy is saying these things are not in play, but what is really in play? What are the things? What are the real tactics, techniques, and procedures? Well, it's still the same old story. It's about social engineering, phishing. It's about weak, stolen, or otherwise compromised passwords that really make up the majority of initial attacks. And so the thing that you have to keep in mind, today's reality is hackers don't hack in anymore. They log in using weak default or stolen or otherwise compromised credentials. I can go right now to the dark web and I can pull up repositories of passwords. And I can pay a couple $100. I get thousands of passwords. And now I can basically try out these passwords if they work in specific accounts, and the likelihood that they work is very high.
Probably high. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And so this is the reality, and it's really a recent example is the Snowflake data breach. If you were a Ticketmaster customer, you've definitely heard about it. My wife had tickets for a pop concert, and suddenly her ticket, she got an alert that her tickets got transferred, even though she didn't transfer it. They were gone.
Yep.
They were no longer available. And this was a consequence of this data breach, because the attacker had access to the data. They were able to access the account, change the phone number so that when they would get a multi-factor request, that they can answer it, and they transferred the tickets. Obviously, Ticketmaster reimbursed her for it. But this is a good example. Snowflake is holding huge amounts of data for different companies. Ticketmaster, one example. The other one, which is a far bigger impact for all of us, was a background checking company out of Canada. It's being used in North America predominantly. It's the #1 background checking company. So if you apply for a job, if you are in interaction with law enforcement, if you apply for a passport, this is the service that's being used. So that database was holding social security number, everything. And unfortunately, Snowflake did not use multi-factor authentication. So a compromised credential of one of the employees at a third-party company allowed unauthorized access to all these different data lakes. And that shows how important it is to really focus on the things that matter most.
And Torsten, can I jump in real quick and answer your
Yep,
question?
sure.
So outside of the internal threats maybe being solely based on like a monetary payout for somebody working for an organization, if the data keeps showing us that it is human error, why do you think that is? Is it solely just education? Is it why does that keep happening? What's your view on that?
I mean, when it comes to insider threats, there are a lot of people that configure things wrong, that contribute to data breach. We had examples at Marriott. There was an employee that was responsible for their AWS cloud configuration, and they simply made mistakes when they configured the security settings, and that left their AWS data lake open to the public. And so insider does not always mean malicious insiders. It can
Okay.
be really people that are making mistakes. Um, but the human factor across the board plays a big role, even in external attacks, as we talked about, because we are all probably guilty. We use passwords for private purposes. You kind of protect your bank account, and most likely use the same password for
Right.
your
Yep.
work account because it's easier to remember. And so these are kind of our human shortcomings.
Yep. Yep.
So another thing that Chuck was saying, okay, so now that we have all these attacks going on and all these bad things happening, what's happening from a industry standards and regular compliance perspective? Who's really kind of guarding us? And it's kind of interesting to see, because the reality, the bitter truth is, it's no longer a matter of if, but when an organization will suffer a data breach. And so many industry oversight agencies, as well as the governments, have realized we have to step in here. We have to protect citizens, but also businesses, and we have to give them guidance. And so you have this pyramid. There are laws like FISMA and HIPAA. There are decrees like HITECH, and the IRS even has specific stipulations around cybersecurity. And then you have government regulations, be it on the privacy side, GDPR, obviously top of mind. You have DHS and other organization kind of issue regulations. And then on top of it, many industry association like PCI, which is probably one of the most prescriptive regulations that you can find. NERC for the energy electricity area, they provide common advice as an oversight agency. And then you have industry standards like NIST, um, the ISO in Europe, CIS. So there's a lot of things that is being done, but again, it's almost overkill. There are 900 oversight agencies worldwide, and there are about 200 daily regulatory updates that are being published. How would you keep
How
track
do you
of
keep
all of
up with
this,
that?
correct?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so it's really tricky. As a mid-sized company, on average, you're dealing with 17 industry or government regulations. If you're a larger company, that bypasses more than 70 regulations. And that's why they normally have their own governance risk compliance departments that are just looking after what are the changes, how do we apply this. But another thing is, back in the day, we thought when we follow these regulations and we check the box to get certified, we're secure. But I think the reality has proven that's not true. It's checkbox mentality doesn't necessarily help here. And quite frankly, there are some frameworks out there that are probably providing better guidance than others. And that was another question that Chuck came up with, kind of, okay, we looked at this whole field of regulation standards. What are some of the effective cybersecurity frameworks? And when he asked me that question, I was torn. I mean, obviously NIST for me, the NIST cybersecurity framework was a milestone in the cybersecurity industry because there were two things that really characterize this um, standard or guidance. One is that it was starting to think in particular pillars how to operate your cybersecurity, how to establish it. Initially, it was about identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering. In the 2.0 version, they added a new pillar, which is around governing. And I think having these buckets help anybody that is tasked to kind of look after compliance and industry standards to at least structure their thought process accordingly. The second unique thing about this cybersecurity framework was that it deviated from that traditional view of checkbox mentality. It introduced risk as a new guiding principle. I've written once an article where I stated risk is security's new compliance. If you
Mm.
do it right, unfortunately, not every organization has transitioned to that approach yet. But just I mentioned Poodle vulnerability earlier, correct? So it has had a very low CVS score compared to others. So I would say, okay, my risk exposure is low, but I'm not taking the entirety of context into account. Because if I would have known that at this specific time it's being exploited actively in the wild, I would have no longer listened to the CVS score. I would have now changed my approach and said, oh, this is really a big exposure. There's risk, immediate risk associated, and therefore I would fix it. So having this risk-based approach was a game changer. So you have to give a lot of credit to NIST. And then I don't know what the mix of our audience is, if you're small business, if you're a medium-sized business or a larger organization. But for the first time in version 2.0, NIST focused in on a small, medium-sized business. They created for the first time a small business quick start guide, which gives more practical guidance on how to apply these 100 plus controls to your environment. So it was very nicely done. Finally, they acknowledged this is a framework that's being consumed not just by government, not just by large organization, but even by small organization.
I think
I just referenced more than 100 controls. This might be still overwhelming, correct? And that's why I second guessed myself and said, hey, let's take a look at another framework which is simpler. And these are the CIS controls. That's the version 8. It's the latest version. There are 8 controls. So 18 controls. So I should be able, 18 controls, that should be far easier to manage, correct? And you can see that access control management, data protection, data recovery, these are some of the things that you kind of underlying heard earlier when we talked about attacks, credential abuse, weak or stolen, compromised passwords. This is covered in these controls. And so while it's quite condensed, I think it really goes down to the basics. If you're still saying, hey, 18 is still too many for me, well, guess what? Our friends in Australia, the Australian Cybersecurity Center, they have their Essential 8. So it's about application controls, especially nowadays that we access applications in the cloud. It has become very important to secure that because a lot of our sensitive data nowadays resides in Salesforce.com or in other SaaS application. Uh, Patching your applications, configuring your Microsoft Office environments accordingly, hardening your environments, restricting privileged access for the people that really have access to your crown jewels, uh, automating your patching practices, and as I mentioned earlier, multi-factor authentication. There's been a lot of articles written recently that it's no longer as effective as in the past, but I tell you, I know a few hackers, be it white hackers or the real hackers, and when you talk with them, they will tell you for them, multi-factor authentication is a major deterrent. Hackers don't want to spend much time. They want to get in and out as
Easy
quickly as
peasy.
possible.
Yeah.
If they have to spend days to figure out how to break in, they move on to the next victim. And so multi-factor authentication is a low-hanging fruit. And then daily backups. So here you have 8 things. And I think definitely boiling it down to 8 things should
Yeah, that's
really help
digestible,
you to
right?
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so now you might say, okay, so he talked about the threats, the threat actors. We just talked about, okay, I'm required, even if you want to take out cybersecurity insurance, um, insurers nowadays say, oh, you have to have specific controls in place to make me feel more comfortable that you limited my risk exposure. But how do you spend your money? You have limited funds. How do you allocate that? Where should I spend it? There's so many security tools out there. I mean, we're spending as an industry hundreds of billions of dollars every year, but we still experience these data breaches. So what do we have to focus on? And here it's my recommendation is going to take a step back and think like a hacker. Understand the approach that a hacker takes, correct? Going back to the tactics, the techniques, the procedures. So again, if password hacking, phishing scams, malware are important, and they're at the front end of the cyber attack chain, if I have a big impact there, if I can stop it right there, they will never get to the server that holds the crown jewels. And that's my goal to really crack that cyber attack chain, break it very early. Same with insider threats. If they have privileges, correct? And if these are standing privileges, that's a bad thing. You should have just-in-time privileges. Only when they need access, they should get those access rights. And then really typically once they're in, and that's normally done in 68% of the cases, the endpoint of the worker is the beachhead into the network. So again, endpoint becomes very important because from there, then now they're scanning the network, they do their reconnaissance, and they're moving laterally. They're hunting for more credentials, higher privileged access credentials that give them more access to the crown jewels. And so if you have this attack chain in mind, quite frankly, it makes it a little bit easier to allocate your resources. For me personally, I always talk about back to the basics. So you should reassess your cybersecurity priorities. Increase security awareness. If people don't know what to look for, they can't react to it, correct? I'm very proud. My sister just went off 6 weeks ago to college in San Diego. And last week, she texted me kind of, Dad, is this a scam? Is this a threat? And she sends me a screenshot of an SMS message that she got, as usual, the urgency, click on this link. She learned from her dad. She learned from security awareness training what to look out for, the urgency, what is the email address domain, all of these things. So training comes in very handy. And there are new emerging technologies that are not just kind of doing quizzes. They're quite interesting concepts where you watch almost like Netflix type movies that educate you. And then there are new tools out there that are even simulating with the help of AI specific scenarios of incidents where the employees are being asked how would they respond to it. And based on their response, they get kind of scored and you can address any type of gaps. The second thing to focus on to put funding behind is go beyond passwords. Really look at multi-factor authentication. Again, very low-hanging fruit, very affordable. If you have privileged users that have access to your crown jewels on servers, apply privilege access principles there. And then if you wanted to go out zero trust, where really you don't trust anything, there are some very affordable solutions out there that are offered by Chuck and others, where you can really step up your security efforts tremendously and really go far beyond the password. The other thing that I mentioned, one of the early beachheads into an organization are endpoints. So why not leverage endpoint detection and response? And if you don't want to do that yourself, reach out to Chuck. He can manage that on your behalf. So you can lay in bed, read your book, while he and his team will take care of everything.
Handle it for you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then last but not least, I mean, there is no 100% protection. If you have vendors come to you and make that promise, throw them out the door.
Mm-hmm.
It's not true. There's no 100% protection. And if that's the truth, then you have to think about how do I make my business resilient? And that starts with data protection for your endpoints, for your SaaS application, and that's a blind spot. If you have Microsoft 365, if you have Salesforce, you believe that those vendors back up your data and secure the data. No, there's a shared responsibility model, meaning you're responsible for that. They take care of the infrastructure, but you're responsible for that data. So it's important to back that up too. And then if you leverage cloud environments like Google Cloud or AWS, Microsoft Azure, you also have any data that's there, you have to back that up and do that in an efficient way. Again, Chuck can help you here because there are solutions out there that really cover all aspects in a single console. And so it makes it very easy. And so that's my recommendation. It's kind of the best cybersecurity on a beer budget. If you focus on those four areas, you cover probably 98% of all TTPs that typically cause data breaches. So it really minimizes your risk exposure. So that was what I had to say. Charles, do you have any questions or the audience?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you real quick too about so the last slide with EDR. Sometimes when we're talking to people, they'll say, "Well, I already have like an antivirus solution in place." Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how EDR is different from antivirus and maybe why antivirus alone is not necessarily the strongest tool to have in your tool
Yeah,
belt?
yeah. I mean, we hear that unfortunately quite often. So antivirus was one of the first tools available for endpoints, and it was great at the time. But the threats have emerged, the malware and virus combinations. There's so many variants out there on a daily basis that antivirus can't keep up. Antivirus is a signature-based approach. I need to know that signature, meaning I look at the endpoint and I compare what I see on the endpoint with my database of known signature. If I have a match, then I throw an alert. If I don't have a match, I don't throw alerts. The problem is today, most of the malware and viruses are not known at the time. Uh, that is one drawback. The other one is that the frequency of scanning is far more limited compared to EDR solution. EDR is continuous monitoring. Antivirus is, let's say, once a day, once a week. So there's a huge gap in between. It also doesn't come with all full-blown capabilities with endpoint detection and response. Those technologies allow you, for instance, to automatically roll back if there's an exposure. So you're still operational. You're not kind of impacted. Antivirus tools don't do that. Obviously, antivirus over the time has evolved, and what we see there vendors like Bitdefender out there that combine in their EDR solutions still traditional antivirus components, but EDR is basically the label on the product. But yeah, we see this right now. We're talking with many of our partners where we try to give them an incentive to move from antivirus to EDR. We get two kind of arguments. One is price. Quite frankly, yes, antivirus is still less expensive than an
Sure.
EDR solution. However, if it exposes you to bigger risk
Yeah,
and
exactly.
makes you
Yeah.
even potentially liable, um, I'd rather spend $1 more to close that gap. And the second thing that we hear is that endpoint detection and response is a quite sophisticated technology, and suddenly you might get overwhelmed with all the alerts that you're getting. And that's really where the second item here on the slide, managed EDR, comes in, where you could leverage your MSP that takes that off your plate. You can still focus on running your business, and the MSP, their team of experts, are now looking at the alerts, and they will only inform you of the real
Real
significant things that are
troubles.
happening. And so that's something that can be easily addressed if that's a concern.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for the clarification on that. That's great. And we have two questions. Kyle's got some great questions. The first one, how can an organization reasonably protect data outside their direct control with a third party?
Mhm. Um, so if you have data in a SaaS application or in cloud environments, again, there are technologies out there that are integrating into these third-party solutions and are able to back up the data and recover the data, and that's the important component. Back in the day, we always thought solely about backup, but the recovery part is a very
Just
important
as
component.
important. Yeah.
And so these technologies exist. And then obviously supply chain attacks have become very common nowadays. Um, I mean, the Snowflake example that I mentioned, that's a good example. So obviously the very typical approach is you're asking for filling out a vendor risk assessment when you engage with these people. But in reality, you should go beyond and even ask if they're having specific certification be it SOC 2, be it ISO 27001, FedRAMP, any type of this, which shows what type of breadth of security controls they apply to their environment.
Very nice. Thank you for that. And then another great question too. So Kyle is asking about talking about the value of SIM backed by a SOC. Many people I talk to think of it only as a valuable after an incident. So why should they pay for it up? Why should they pay for it up front?
Yeah, I mean,
question.
I mean, the lines are blurring, correct? The SIM system was used in the past to consume log files to do, in reality, forensic analysis, because log files are historic data. It's not real-time data. It's historic data that I query to see, are there any things that I missed, and hopefully find it before something bigger happens. So that's what the SIM equates to. Obviously, to operate a SIM, there's a lot of fine tuning required, and there's a lot of expertise required. Because again, I can only react to something as I see something. To see something in a SIM, I have to ask the right question, meaning I have to be a querying expert and a cybersecurity expert to ask the right question to my data to get the proper answer. A lot of, especially smaller and mid-sized businesses, don't have that expertise. They can't afford this expertise, and that's again where an MSP can come in to augment talent and help with that. Obviously, there are new technologies called XDR that have emerged where it's now real-time monitoring. So you could argue that XDRs, depending which vendor you listen to, the SIM vendor or the XDR vendor, there's a big war going on right now. Who provides more value? I still believe that logs need to be preserved. Simply, there is obligations under regulations whereby for forensic analysis, for post-mortem analysis, you have to have access to that, and a SIM can help aggregate that data without you having to spend months to pile up that same data.
Very nice. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, great questions. Anybody else have any other questions? You can feel free to come off mute or drop them in the chat. Great information. Al says thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Again, if you have any question, feel free. Don't be shy. Mutlu, anything from you or Stephanie, Janet, anybody? Happy to answer any question you might have.
We can, Torsten, would you be okay when I send out updates to include a link to your LinkedIn profile?
Most definitely. And again, thank you. I know we all have a busy schedule, but thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And Chuck and I talked earlier. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people that are in the path of the hurricane that impacts the southern part of the country. We keep our fingers crossed that everybody will be safe. And again, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for being on today, Torsten. I really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. And again, if anyone needs some help with some NIST assessments, we'll send out some information on how we can get you started with that. Perfect. All right, have a great day, everybody. Be well, be safe, and thank you again, Torsten.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.